House is a 1986 horror comedy directed by Steve Miner. And if that name rings any bells, that's probably because he's the same guy that directed Friday the 13th 2 and 3 and also Halloween H2O. House follows the story of Roger Cobb, an ex-Vietnam soldier who is now a horror author and wants to write a book about his experiences in Vietnam. He decides to spend solace and solitude at his childhood home, where his aunt recently killed herself, and he discovers that there is something dark lurking inside of the house. Hence the name House. Happy Independence Day to everyone. Happy 4th of July. We here in the States, here in America, are truly blessed with all the freedoms we have, and to all of our troops, men and women of bravery, thank you for your service. And if you watch my channel, and if you're watching this video, please leave a comment. I'd love to pin it and share you. But to celebrate, I wanted to talk about this movie, House, because it's a weird movie, and it's very underrated, and the reason I incorporated it into my Independence Day celebration on my channel is because it has to do with a Vietnam soldier dealing with PTSD and the struggles that come with serving his nation. So, I'm trying to think of where to start with this movie. So, in the mid-'80s, there was a movie called The Twilight Zone movie, which was essentially an anthology of 4 different stories based upon the original Twilight Zone show. Anyways, this writer, and I don't know if Steve Miner was a part of this, I know he directed it, but anyways, the writer wanted to make an anthology with many different stories in it, like the Twilight Zone movie, and unfortunately it fell through, but he took one of the stories and expanded it to a feature, and the story, of course, was the one in House, following an author named Roger Cobb, who goes to this house where he grew up and experiences these dark, twisted things inside the house. And because he was a soldier, the ghosts, if you will, the monsters, ghouls, whatever they are in the house, use that PTSD and his troubled past to dig into him, if you will, and torment him, essentially.
Hi.
Sandy.
I tried to call, but there was no answer. I was worried about you, Roger.
What are you doing here?
I wanted to see you. What are you doing with that gun?
Nothing. Sandy.
And so this movie, like I said, was based upon the Twilight Zone film, and a lot of this movie is entangled in a bunch of other horror lore. There's nods and references to other horror movies. Kane Hodder was a part of this movie doing the stunts. You have these elaborate monsters in the movie that kind of are representations of the house and of Roger's PTSD, I guess, that come alive. There's one puppet in the movie that took like 15 people to operate, which is crazy, and I love practical effects, and this movie sure has a lot of them. This movie, though, is not just a horror film. It's actually a horror comedy, and I would say more so a comedy than it even is horror. This was a transitionary movie for Steve Miner, because before this, he really had the Friday the 13th films to his name, and he wanted to get more into comedy and lightheartedness, and this was kind of the intermittent thing that started his comedy career, of course, then going back to horror with H2O and a few other horror films here and there. But this movie kind of stands as, personally, one of the most interesting horror comedies I've seen. I've seen a lot of them. I think it's a great subgenre of horror and of comedy, I guess. But those really work well, and in this movie, it plays off the fact that his Vietnam flashbacks and memories are haunting him, but at the same time, he's this humorous writer and author, and he has a funny neighbor that reminds me of John Candy, who I guess was in the Cheers TV show. That actor later would be in Cheers. And the comedy, I will say, sometimes is a little too strong for my taste. I really love comedy and I love horror, but in order for the horror to work, the monster has to be a legitimate threat to the main character. And in this movie, the threats and the monsters were a little too cartoonish, and you could tell that Roger was going to be okay with a lot of the monsters. Even though they looked great, you can tell that a lot of them just were no threat to him, of course, and the people that came to visit him in the house. There's also a twist ending, kind of. There's a revelation made by Roger about what's actually happening in the house. It's a revenge plot, and I don't want to spoil the entire ending in case you want to check out this film for Independence Day or whenever you're watching this video. But I felt like, while it was an interesting twist, the way he destroys the entity in the house was really anticlimactic, I guess. It's almost like, why didn't you just do that from the very beginning? But there are some good scenes in this movie. The opening scene was really effective, where this delivery boy is bringing his aunt, groceries in the house, and he walks into the house and he doesn't know where she is, and something happens that's very traumatic, and it stuck out to me. There's a lot of good editing choices in here that are very fun and choppy, and add to the comedy, of course. And the main actor who plays Roger was pretty likable. I liked his character, and even though they made him do some goofy stuff because of the humorous elements in the movie, I feel like he delivered a solid performance as this author. It reminded me a little bit of Misery and a little bit of The Shining in the sense of an author dealing with repercussions. In Misery, the author is the protagonist, and in The Shining, of course, Jack becomes crazy. And they kind of play it both ways in this movie, where Roger, you think he's doing bad things because of his PTSD, but then you realize it's the house targeting him. So there's a good balance there, and they throw some ideas around that I really like. Overall, with all of that being said, quite a mouthful, House is a very enjoyable horror comedy. It's not very scary, but it is quite funny and entertaining. Ultimately, I think the scares could have been more effective, but I appreciate the direction and the editing choices and the special effects in the movie, and I think for a fun 80s flick, it's worth your time. This movie doesn't get talked about a lot, especially in the mainstream of the horror community, people who like the Annabelle movies or the Conjuring series. A lot of people don't talk about these underground 80s horror films, but it's worth checking out just to see horror history and to see a fun movie that is comparable to many other films of that era. With that being said, I'm going to give House a 3 out of 5 skulls on the R.I.P. Reviews rating scale. Have a happy Independence Day, everybody. I'll see you in the next video, and remember, as always, for all things Halloween, this is Hauntformer.